All right, everyone. So today we're going to be going through part two of the undervalued players, and this is going to begin with the Colorado Rockies. I will link part one if you are interested in watching that and missed out on it earlier. But anyways, we're just going to go ahead and jump right into it. So first player on this list is Randall Grichuk. He is undervalued because the Rockies really do not like his 1 year, approximately $10 million contract. Obviously, he's not really the best option available as a corner outfielder. He's even difficult to use VL as a right fielder where his defense is solid. I mean, realistically, you're not going to use him. You might even release him outright upon acquiring him. But he is valued by the Rockies much less than his relatively poor contract would suggest. Likewise, Ryan McMahon, very oddly, is pretty much despised by the Rockies for his contract. He's not the greatest second baseman, though he can play there, but he is a solid third baseman. I would say above average defensively. He can flex in the corner outfield if needed. His contract's reasonably affordable through age 32 for 15 million or less a year. It's not a great contract by any means, but it's not a bad contract. He's a prankster. This is the kind of player where if you want to get some value out of a trade, looking for somebody who can come really cheap and turn into more value talent elsewhere. You need a third baseman. McMahon might be somebody worth looking into. Next up is Lucas Gilbreth, who's on this list because the Rockies quite literally do not value him at all. And he is a capable middle reliever, long reliever, specialist type when he comes back from Tommy John. There's no guarantees that he actually comes back and he's still these Rays, which he pretty much is the bare minimum to be a decent middle reliever. But regardless, the fact that he comes at no cost and he is cost controlled makes him a worthwhile target. Peter Lambert is on this list because they think he's negative value. Now, I'm not here to tell you that Lambert is a good player. He is an okay player at best. He's a 25-year-old, or almost 26, frankly, starting pitcher who's unlikely to his potential. Maybe he becomes a borderline starter. He's really more of a long reliever or a depth piece, even. But he's on the list because they think he's negative value, even though he's really net zero at pretty much the most. And Gabriel Hughes is the only prospect in the Rockies organization that I would really call undervalued to any degree. And even so, this is a bit of a stretch because at best, he's going to be a bottom rotation starting pitcher. He's almost 22. He's still got some development left to go. With these Rockies, there's really not a ton of value to be had here, although obviously a little bit since we're not giving up too much and we're getting some decent players back. Now, frankly, this trade, I think we're winning a lot less than most of the average trades that I've been discussing so far, and McMahon and Gilbreth are really the only two particularly valuable pieces in the organization. But nonetheless, still worth looking into at least some of the time. There are so many undervalued players in the Tigers organization that I'm actually going to do this in two parts so I can break it up a little bit. First part is going to include the following players, a lot of really interesting MLB pieces for the most part, starting with Riley Green. Riley Green is pretty much as close as you can get to a young superstar corner outfielder who's undervalued in the game right now. His contact skills, his pretty much everything about his batting profile, to be quite honest, is all borderline all-star to all-star level, especially at full development, which is not completely unrealistic at a middle 22 years old and reasonable development. His corner outfield defense is excellent. The way I like to think of him is like a much better Alec Thomas, and he costs. I mean, he is not cheap, but he certainly doesn't come at a superstar price, which is really where he should be. Next up, we got Eduardo Rodriguez, who is another very interesting player to me in that he is a quality middle rotation starter. He's got plus stuff, movement, and control. He's a left-handed starting pitcher. He's only about 30. He's slightly better against lefties than righties. He's got an opt-out after year one, so there's not even a 100% guarantee that he gets his full contract, which only runs through his age 33 season. He's making 15 to 20 million a year, usually closer to 15. He's got good stamina. He's got solid hold runners. He's got a lot of pitches. He's a well-rounded starter. He's pretty much exactly what you want. So the fact that the Tigers think he's such a negative value makes him incredible to trade for because he's just such a good player. And there's, again, so many players in this organization that are really good acquisitions that you throw Eduardo Rodriguez into a trade. You're not only picking up a solid player at what is, I honestly think this contract is about fair, if not slightly below his actual value. Um, and you're getting a good amount of value in any trade you make here for players like Riley Green become a lot easier to get once you add Eduardo Rodriguez. Next up is Spencer Torkelson. There's a couple things I want to emphasize here. First thing, he's almost 24, so the odds of him fully developing are not that great, but he doesn't need to add that much more to be a solid hitter. He's already, frankly, not a bad hitter overall, and just a touch more on the offense. He's suddenly an above average, decent quality hitter overall. Now he's young, he's cheap, he costs pretty much nothing to pick up as well, and he can play corner outfield defense, which is a Pavin Smith type value is kind of where I'd have him pegged, frankly. He's this year's Pavin Smith. He costs next to nothing to trade for. He's got a solid bat. He's not the greatest hitter ever, but he's a solid hitter, and he can trade in the corner outfield. So Spencer Torkelson, really excellent value at the moment. Alex Lange, he's an interesting player. He is a borderline starting pitcher in the fact that if he adds just a touch more stamina, he's capable of being a starter, a pretty solid one at that, an upper middle rotation starter in terms of his overall abilities. His stuff, movement, and control as a reliever, though, are what really are making him worth trading for. He does not cost very much to get. And as a higher end reliever, he not only brings a little more stamina to the table than most, but he is a quality reliever. There's really no reason for him to be as cheap as he is. He's team controlled and cost controlled as well. There's a lot to like about him. Jason Foley, another cheap cost controlled reliever, high movement, high control, very good against righties while still solid against lefties. Brings good defense to the table. Not that that's particularly important, but ultimately here he is absolutely a quality reliever and costs next to nothing to get. So a solid addition if you need someone in the middle relief role who can play well for you for cheap. Jake Rogers, a very solid versus left catcher, also not too bad versus right. He could play the infield, first base mostly, and but his value is going to come as a solid defensive catcher, especially in preventing the running game. He's a leader. He's on a minor league, well, not on a minor league contract necessarily, but he is obviously cost controlled. He's a cheap catcher to pick up, and that's really the big appeal here. He can be a solid backup catcher. He can be a solid depth piece. I believe he has options left. Yeah, he's got an option left. So the next to no price on him really makes him quite a valuable piece to go acquire. Ryan Kreidler is a very interesting player to me. He's decent at second base or third base. He can technically flex at shortstop. He can be your utility infielder. You can play the outfield if you need. He's a solid VL hitter. There's a lot to like here. He's not a bad base runner either. Ultimately, the big upside with Kreidler is that he costs next to nothing. He's a solid player wherever you really want to use him, but he is especially valuable in the fact that, I mean, he is pretty much, as utility infielders go, probably number one right now in price, in decent quality player overall. He's cheap and team controlled. There's a lot, as with most of these players, to like here with Kreidler. Tyler Horton, decent starting pitcher. He can slot into your rotation towards the bottom for pretty cheap. He's a lefty, of course. He's cost controlled and team controlled. He's a fan favorite, so that you're also going to improve your fan interest, which is, of course, very critical to do early on in the OTP cycle. Um, Solid player at next to no acquiring cost. Matt Manning, another solid pitcher at next to no acquiring cost. Now he's 25. This is a lot like the Slade Ciccone situation, but he's even older. The odds that Manning fully develops are not high. But as he is, he's not a bad bottom rotation starting pitcher, and there is that chance that he does develop a touch more, becomes a little bit better towards the bottom of your rotation. He costs next to nothing to get. He's cheap and team controlled. Same deal as pretty much a lot of the other players. And last, the only prospect that I was able to fit in this trade is Abel Bastidas. He's a little bit less undervalued in my opinion compared to most of these players, but he's 19, pretty well developed bat at this point, solid second base defense. You can exceed this potential. He has the potential to become a solid starting second baseman. He is a switch hitter as well with minimal splits, which adds to his value. Anyways, I'm going to go ahead and set up the second set of trades for the Tigers because there are more undervalued players on this roster. All right, we've got our second set of Tigers, and first on the list is Dylan Dingler, who right now is probably my single favorite catching prospect to acquire. He is almost 25, so the bat's probably not going to fully develop, but as it is, he's almost an average hitter. He's got a solid bat overall. The catcher ability and arm makes him an excellent, well, not necessarily excellent, but a very strong defensive catcher in the game right now. And this is really the big appeal. He costs relatively lower end. He's obviously still a prospect, so team controlled, cheap player, very good defense. There's a lot about Dingler that makes him he's more a solid starter really than anything. He can be a backup and is absolutely viable in that role as well, but certainly a quality player at this point to pick up. Now, Wilmer Flores is a little bit of a weird situation in the fact that he's a borderline starter, which kind of stings because if he was a full starter with 60, 65, 60, he would be one of the most valuable prospects in the game right now to acquire. But the fact that he's a borderline starter slightly tinges his value. Now, as such, he is still a very good reliever. He has the slight reverse split, so if he does develop into a full starter, he can be very good as a middle or even better rotation type player. Stuff, movement, and control are obviously all quite good. And yeah, a lot about Wilmer Flores that makes him a very solid player at a more middle tier acquisition price. He's not quite cheap, but he is still very good value to get. Parker Meadows, another center fielder. He's minimal acquisition cost, and that's really the big draw here. The bat is not big enough to outweigh really any of the top center field prospects. The defense obviously lags a little bit behind. He's a viable utility outfielder, though, with good base running as well, solid personality. But ultimately, with Meadows, his big appeal is that he's very cheap to acquire. And last, we got Gage Workman, who likewise is really cheap, but is pretty much that second baseman that we were talking about earlier from the Tigers, except a little bit better overall. He has better defense at second, of course. Well, not necessarily better, but about the same second base defense, and a more developed bat, being almost, well, he is 23 and a switch hitter with a little bit of room to grow, but a solid batting profile overall. If he can develop a touch more, he becomes a close to average hitter. And of course, second base is a pretty scarce position, so if you're making a trade with the Tigers anyway, Workman is not a bad target to fill a hole at second base for you. Solid base running as well as with a good number of these players. And with that said, we will go ahead and move on to the next team. All right, with the Astros, it really comes down to a lot of players who they think are being well overpaid. And I just want to point out that Kyle Tucker is not actually an undervalued player in this game at all. I believe the Astros truly appreciate his value as one of the best corner outfielders in the game. And I truly mean that because he is young, he's relatively cheap, he's team controlled, he hits very well, he runs the bases very well, he fields very well. He is in this trade because they so heavily undervalue their players that are bigger contracts that even though I believe that this trade would be perfectly fine without Kyle Tucker involved. It's it's such a net negative of value in their opinion from their side of the players that aren't Kyle Tucker that I threw him in just to demonstrate how heavily undervalued they are. So this is absolutely a trade you can make if you want to pick up a big time corner outfielder. You can throw him in to this kind of trade. Now, first off is Brian Abreu, who is I mentioned Matt Brash at the beginning of this series. He is very close, in my opinion, as one of those types of players who's just so ridiculously undervalued. I just do not understand. He costs very, very little to acquire. And you have two options with Brian Abreu. Now, he's a two pitch, he has a weak third pitch guy. He is, for the record, very cost controlled and team controlled. And when you trade for him, it's almost always worth extending him to a long term contract immediately while he still doesn't appreciate his value. But you can use him as either a shutdown reliever, at which point he's got dominant stuff, very strong movement, and not the best control. But again, a good catcher defensively can help offset that and really capitalize on his strong stuff. So Abreu pairs particularly well with a really high catcher ability. But anyways, as a starting pitcher, he's still incredibly talented in the same regards. He's a high stuff, high movement starting pitcher. He can be a middle rotation guy, very effective in that role. I think he's best used as a reliever unless he continues to develop because he's just so good in that role. But the fact that he's so cheap just makes him one of the better value targets at this point, despite his extreme quality as a pitcher. Now, Brian Presley is one of the best relievers in OTP. He's once again a fan favorite, extremely popular, so he boosts your cash earning ability when you trade for him. He costs 14 million over 2 years and then a team option, which you probably decline. I think he's overpaid a little bit, but he is a high leverage type guy. He's very good, very high stuff, quality movement and control, very high quality movement and control at that. Um, yeah, he's 34, but he's unlikely to decline to the point where he's no longer a very good reliever at the least. And the Astros just think he's absolute trash. You can get most of these players that I actually consider plus value just with Presley for free. So yeah, it's 14 million, but I mean, you're getting two high leverage relievers if you look at Abreu and Presley alone for absolutely nothing. That's just incredible value. Pedro Leon, a solid corner outfield prospect. He can also, I'm going to add here, play the infield a little bit. He's not a bad third baseman, which, as usual, there's a lot of valuable third basemen. He's as a batter, probably slightly below average, but he is a very strong base runner. His corner outfield defense in particular is very solid. He can play center field, not the best, but he is capable. Overall, a quite solid prospect available for, again, a very minimal price, and it is the price that makes him the biggest draw. Phil Matone, a very solid reliever, mind you. Higher stuff, solid movement, not bad control. Only 2.5 million. The Astros think that he is net negative value, so he's absolutely a decent addition to your middle relief corps most of the time, and costs next to nothing in terms of his actual monetary cost and trade cost. Obviously, he'll be a nice throw into any trade you make as considering a net negative value. And Rafael Montero, finally. Now, he is absolutely overpaid. He's making 11.5 million for 3 years. He's a little bit older, and unlike Presley, he's not a high leverage reliever. He's not a bad middle reliever. He's got solid stuff, but he's certainly not. Biggest draw with Montero is really going to be the fact that the Astros just despise him so much. They think he's just such horrible value that they're willing to do pretty much whatever it takes to get rid of his money. And this is really where Kyle Tucker comes in. This Kyle Tucker, it's not possible without Montero. You kick him from this trade, and as you can see, it becomes a lot more expensive to execute. So he is a critical piece to making any trade at a much better value. And last on this list, we've got Miguel Ulola, who is a starting pitcher development, and you're going to notice that he has really good stuff, which is a big draw with a lot of starting pitchers, especially the prospects this year. He's not even 21 yet, so as a prospect, he's got quite good potential. And of course, if he develops that velocity anymore, that fastball slider combination is really going to benefit. So you can count on him turning into a pretty solid, I'd say, bottom to middle rotation starting pitcher. But the fact that he costs so little, again, is quite the draw here for the Astros trade. And next, we're going to go ahead and head on to the Royals and see who they've got undervalued. All right, with the Kansas City Royals, we have an interesting collection of players, including two very critical options that I am starting to target in almost all of my OTP games right now. First of them is Nicky Lopez. And while a poor hitter, he is also a spark plug and a shortstop, a viable starting shortstop, which is a very big deal in live OTP starts because most shortstops are very difficult to trade for, especially the stronger fielders. And Nicky Lopez absolutely covers quality defense, not necessarily quite gold glove, but at least borderline top five in the position. Very good shortstop overall. He is a good base runner, very solid player overall, and not expensive to trade for. Next up is MJ Melendez, who I finally has had his defense tank, which I'm very unhappy about, but it is what it is. Ultimately, there are a couple of things that I really like about Melendez. Number one is his captain personality. He's a very strong captain almost all the time, really helps the chemistry. He's a good hitter. He's a very good hitter. He hits very well VR and solid VL as well. And while he doesn't have the best ability, his arm is still strong enough to control the running game. Furthermore, if you don't want to use him as a catcher, move him to left field or right field. He's a good corner outfielder defensively. So a lot about Melendez that makes him a very solid player overall. And frankly, his bat does hold up in the corner outfield. He is also cheap, team controlled, and while he is a little bit pricier to acquire for a catcher, he's still very cheap. And given his overall value at the position, I certainly think that he's one of the more undervalued players overall. Now, Hunter Dozier, he's not the worst player ever, frankly. I think he's a viable utility type guy for the corner positions. He's not the worst corner outfielder defensively. He's almost a decent starting third baseman. You can start him at third base if you really want to. But the big draw here, he's got 2 years on his contract. The third year is obviously a buyout. They're less than $10 million, so he costs something, but not a lot. He's obviously not worth the money. But the Royals despise his contract. They will do a lot to get rid of him, including give you MJ Melendez for free. And I'm not exaggerating with this. This is how you get MJ Melendez most of the time. These three players are almost a must acquire, and then of course next come Gentry and Zerpa, who I will generally like to target as well. Now Gentry, biggest thing about him, solid corner outfield defense, but a plus bat. He is an above average hitter. He's 24, nearly fully developed. Obviously, there's still a touch of room to grow. But he doesn't necessarily need to he doesn't have a lot to grow into left. And he's the kind of guy you can plug into a corner outfield spot, very low cost of acquisition, and just be a solid producer. Angel Zerpa is a solid starting pitcher potential. Now, obviously, he's got 2 months left on an injury, but he costs very little to acquire if fully developed, which isn't a huge stretch. And if he just comes closer, then he's solid as a bottom rotation starter. He's a very good starting pitcher. Certainly a solid player to get whenever you're trading with the Royals. Anyways, we will head on to the next team. Okay, before I discuss the rest of the Angels, I want to talk about Shohei Ohtani for a couple of reasons here. So the first thing is that you obviously, when you're trading for Ohtani, for whatever reason, they think he's way more valuable as a DH than a starting pitcher, so make sure you have him set as a starting pitcher. Second thing, he is far and away not only the best player in real baseball, which is genuinely my opinion, he is far and away the best player in OTP. So yes, it looks ridiculous that I'm trading Zach Gallen, Ketel Marte, and a prospect for a single player. But if you consider Ketel Marte and Zach Gallen's individual contributions versus Ohtani's overall contributions, Ohtani blows Gallen away as a starting pitcher. He has the same movement, he has a little bit better stuff, and he has a little bit better control, much higher stuff. Stamina and hold runners, I believe, is about the same. And as a hitter, he absolutely blows Ketel Marte away. Now, we'll look at Ketel Marte as a right fielder because that's pretty much the only position that Ohtani's ever going to play defensively. Ohtani's a dominant power hitter, very quality guy in the middle of your lineup. Ketel Marte is a solid hitter overall, but absolutely does not compare. Now, he's a slightly better fielder, absolutely, in the corner outfield. But Ohtani's value as a hitter is just so much greater. Now, the big drawback to Ohtani, he is no longer a multiple-year control guy at a relatively affordable contract. He is now $30 million for 1 year to trade for him. He is going to require a very massive extension to retain. So overall, you're obviously losing a lot of control here. You're probably losing out on similar stuff. But if you're just looking to build the most dominant team possible, Ohtani is almost a must-have because his cost of acquisition, I believe, does not accurately reflect his downright ridiculous talent level and value in OTP right now. Now, that said, if Ohtani reaches free agency and does not receive an extension, which is almost 100% of the time, he seems to be ridiculously cheap to sign to a contract. I've been able to get him for under $200 million on longer controlled deals. So 20 to 25 million AAV throughout his prime and a little bit post prime is just insane value. Ohtani is very weird in OTP right now. The game does not handle him well. I don't really know what else to say. He's an almost must have at some point in every OTP save at the moment. Anyways, I'm going to head on to the rest of the Angels now. All right, with the Angels, first of all, we've got legendary center fielder Brett Phillips, who is one of the best defensive players in OTP right now. Now, I just want to preface this by saying that in comparison with guys like Michael Ciani, you're probably not going to trade for Brett Phillips. However, He is potentially the best center fielder defensively in OTP right now. He's an excellent base runner and base stealer. He has a solid bat that I would say slightly below league average, but probably a little bit better than you'd think at first, especially given how undervalued I seems to be. So while his cost of acquisition is a little bit on the higher end, he's still a valuable player to trade for. Chris Rodriguez costs surprisingly little to trade for, and while he's only a borderline starting pitcher, just a little bit of a bump here or there will get him up to a full starting pitcher. And as a starting pitcher, he can really excel. High stuff, high movement, not horrible control. Um, and as a reliever, he's obviously still quite a valuable player, but really the cost of acquisition is the big thing since it is very little, though he is certainly a talented player. Now, David Fletcher, I kind of went back and forth about whether or not to include him on this list for a couple of reasons. First of all, is the contract. It certainly is very affordable, and frankly, that is one of the big draws for me. With his quality second base defense, arguably a borderline shortstop given how much defense has fallen off for live players this year. But the bat, I really, he's not a top option for me. But if you're making a trade with the Angels and you can get him on the cheaper side, which is not always a guarantee, mind you, he can be worth it still. We've got Jordan Adams, who's a solid center field prospect, but comes with a couple of drawbacks. First of all, is the bat, which once fully developed is close to major league average. It still isn't quite there, but he's almost certainly not going to fully develop that power given that he's an older, or not an older 23, but he is 23. Now, he is, however, a very good base stealer and base runner with decent corner outfield and center field defense. So he's really more of a cheap to acquire utility outfielder than anything else. You hope maybe he becomes a starter somewhere, but the odds are not necessarily in his favor for that. And last, we've got Eric Torres, who's very minimal cost to acquire. Relief pitcher, lefty, very good stuff, solid movements, solid, well, not bad control is really what I should be saying. But a big thing to look at here is that he's very weirdly very low velocity. So there's absolutely no guarantees of this at his age. But if he does add even a little bit of velocity, his stuff goes all the better. And of course, if his movement continues to develop, you're looking at a very solid pitcher here in Eric Torres. And that's about all for the Angels. So with that, we'll go ahead and head on to the other Los Angeles team, the Dodgers. All right, with the Dodgers, much like the Astros, it tends to come down towards more the players they don't like than anything else, which is why Dustin May is included. He essentially serves the same role that Kyle Tucker serves, as a very high value player that the Dodgers do value accurately, if not slightly overvalue. But in the trade, because they just undervalue everyone else so much, they hate their contracts to such an extreme level that he's here to demonstrate that. All right, so we're going to start here with Yency Almonte, who is valued pretty well by the Dodgers, actually. Considered to be a good reliever, and he really is. That's pretty much his role. He's just a very good middle reliever. The cost of acquisition is slightly lower than where I'd want him to be. I don't think he's a heavily undervalued player, but if you're making a trade with the Dodgers, usually worth looking at as a potential piece to include in the trade. Max Muncy, and he's on this list because the Dodgers don't like his contract, which I think is very weird. $13 million for 1 year, or $10 million for the next if you pick up that option, which is actually something you should consider if you have Max Muncy. That's not that bad. I mean, he's got a good eye, good power. He's a solidly above average hitter. He's not the greatest defensive second. He's a poor defensive second baseman. He's somewhat viable at third base. He's certainly not a bad first baseman. He can play the corner outfield acceptably if you really need him to. By the corner outfield, I mean left field. So obviously the defense is not valuable, but as a hitter, he's certainly not a bad option to plug in wherever he's needed. So Max Muncy, still a player that I think, considering how much the Dodgers hate his contract too, it's absolutely ridiculous. The cost of acquisition is just so negative. It's kind of funny. Chris Taylor is a lot worse than Max Muncy. Yeah, as a starter, he's kind of viable in the corner outfield just because he's so good defensively in left or right field. You're probably going to use him as a super utility guy, though, if you trade for him. And obviously, paying 10 to 15 million for a super utility guy for 3 years, not great. But the Dodgers hate the fact that he's on that contract so much that they will give you ridiculous value. I mean, he's a lot of why we're able to get Dustin May in this trade. Without Chris Taylor, Dustin May doesn't really happen. He does have good base running. There are some things to like about him. Isn't he is going to provide value to your team if he is on your team, but obviously trading for him is the greatest value you're going to get here. Now, Blake Treinen, you probably look at him and you think, okay, so this is probably a very high leverage reliever at a lower acquisition price, but he does have a torn labrum and he's on a 2-year deal. So you're eating $8 million for 1 year essentially to acquire Treinen. Now, there are two options here. Option one, he doesn't lose anything. You've got money to spare in the offseason. You want to keep him around for the next year as a quality high leverage reliever, $8 million. You can do that. Option number two, he doesn't necessarily, he maybe loses a tick or you don't want to keep him around, so you just decline the option. But either way, at $8 million, the Dodgers hate his money a lot this year. It makes it easy to acquire players like, for example, Dustin May. And last, we got Emmett Sheehan, who is really the only Dodgers player who's undervalued to a significant degree that is actually a quality player. And the big draw here is big time stuff that could make him a lower middle rotation starting pitcher and solid movement. I'm guessing the reason he's so undervalued is his stamina and hold runners are not great, but you can kind of work around that. He is still a solid lower middle rotation starter with his really solid stuff and movement, especially if his stuff continues to develop, which of course at 23, no real guarantees, but you stick him towards the bottom of your rotation year one, hope he develops a bit more, and he's a solid pickup overall. Anyways, that said, I believe the Miami Marlins are our next team, so we'll go ahead and head on. All right, with the Miami Marlins, there are a number of interesting players here. First off is going to be Jacob Amaya, whose real intrigue is cost of acquisition. He is a spark plug second baseman with very solid defense and a bat that can be close to average if fully developed, which is, of course, very unlikely given that he's almost 25 now. But really, the fact that he's so cheap at second base is such a scarce position. If you need a stopgap at second base, Amaya is a nice, cheap acquisition to do so. Dax Fulton. Now, I want to preface this by saying Dax Fulton is usually not particularly cheap to acquire. He's usually a more expensive player. Now, that said, he is one of the better starting pitching prospects in all of OOTP right now. Very solid stuff that's almost fully developed. Great movement and solid control to boot. He is 21 and can add velocity at only 92 94 at the moment, and doing so makes him an even stronger pitcher with that fastball slider combination. And as a lefty, he's even more valuable overall. So generally speaking, Dax Fulton is one of the pitchers I try to get pretty regularly. Now, he is, of course, more expensive, so you're usually going to acquire him along with, say, a Visael Garcia or Tanner Scott, which I'll get to later. But you can get him with a package at a non-expensive cost. All right, next up is Jordan Groshans, another third base option from the get-go. He is, I'd say, about an average hitter overall, maybe slightly below average. His defense at third base is average to slightly above average. He could play the corner outfield. Overall, just a solid cost acquisition. He's a cheaper player who's cost controlled and not a bad third baseman. Nasim Nunez, one of the better shortstops throughout recent OTP history. His bat is finally actually not bad at all. I'd say he's approaching MLB. He's certainly at least replacement level or slightly above that at this point as a hitter. And of course, his base running. He's now a capable stealer, which makes him an even more interesting option. Now, the defense is really, of course, the big selling point here. He's one of the best defensive shortstop prospects in all of OTP. And at only 22 with his bag profile, there's no reason to think that he can't necessarily exceed his current potential. And as a switch hitter, there's even more to like about him overall. And given that he is pretty cheap to get, Nunez is almost a must-have at this point as a prospect in the OTP world. Now, Victor is not quite the glorious player he used to be. He's almost 27, has very little room left to grow. He is a strong base stealer, but as a hitter rather, he's not very good. Really, the best you're going to get out of Victor is a utility outfielder or maybe as an emergency replacement to injury starting center fielder, but he is on this list because his cost to acquisition is pretty much literally zero. Now, Jazz Chisholm Jr. For the record, I just want to say I think Chisholm is ridiculously overrated both in real baseball and in OTP. Well, honestly, not so much in OTP. I think they've just about got him. And he's a strong base runner, strong hitter, decent fielder. Really, if you compare Chisholm to Ketel Marte, there's actually a lot of similarities in the two players. Both can play the outfield. They can play pretty well. Chisholm is a slightly better fielder in the outfield. They both play second base about the same. Chisholm probably has a slight advantage there as well. They're both comparable hitters in terms of their overall value. They're both slight plus hitters. Um, I'd say Chisholm. Ultimately, what we're looking at with him is he's probably a very good defensive corner outfielder who provides you a little bit plus. His cost of acquisition is really the big thing here, though. He's surprisingly non-expensive given his talent level and what you'd expect overall. So Chisholm certainly a solid pickup right now in OTP world. Tanner Scott, cost of acquisition is negative, which to me is very odd. I mean, he is an excellent VL reliever. He's a solid VR reliever. He's a good mill reliever overall, works well with high catcher ability, very strong stuff and movement, lower control. This is pretty much what Tanner Scott has been throughout all recent history. Not super expensive, but the Marlins think he's negative value. Anytime you're making a trade with the Marlins, Tanner Scott is almost a must-have as a middle reliever. Huascar Brazabone, another very solid middle reliever. His cost of acquisition is next to nothing. He's better VR than VL, of course, but very high stuff, solid movement, not bad control. Solid pitch mix overall as well. Definitely the kind of pitcher that you want to pick up for your bullpen if you're making a trade with the Marlins and you have spots to fill, or if you just want a depth piece, he's very good to get. Now, Visael Garcia, he's not good. If you really need a right fielder, maybe you're going to use him as a right fielder when you trade for him, but otherwise he's got pretty much no use. He's not the best hitter. But really, the reason you're trading for him is that he's not too expensive. 3 years at $12 million a pop. But you trade for him as a complement to Dax Fulton to make him a lot easier to get, or somebody of that sort. Avisail Garcia is thought of very poorly by the Marlins, certainly much worse than the $12 million a year. I mean, this trade, we're getting a ton of talent for. We're giving up some stuff, but really they're lesser trade pieces, nothing huge. And it's only costing us $12 million over the 3 years of Avisail Garcia's contract to make all of these acquisitions. And honestly, most of this is going into Chisholm and Fulton of this talent level. And if you took out Chisholm, it would cost very little, or Fulton, it would cost very little to make this trade overall. So Garcia really decreases the cost of any trade to make with the Marlins. Now, Max Meyer is kind of a weird position right now. The way I see him is his cost of acquisition is next to nothing, and when he comes back from Tommy John, he's a solid long reliever. Now, he can evolve into a solid overall starting pitcher. He does have room to grow, but it's unlikely he hits that point. So really, you're just counting on him as a long reliever in a year for a very little acquisition cost, very little cost in terms of monetary cost. Anyways, with that, we will go ahead and head on to our next team. With the Brewers, if you need pitching, they've got pitching. And now they have two aces on the team, Corbin Burnes and Brandon Woodruff. And looking at them side by side, I think Corbin Burnes is probably marginally the better pitcher, but I really think that the gap is a lot smaller than a lot of people think. He has a 5-point advantage in stuff, which is probably slightly better than 5 points, but Woodruff has a 5-point advantage in movement and control, and yeah, it's probably slightly less than 5 points, but ultimately, Woodruff is a leader. He's very popular. He's got dominant stuff, movement, and control. He's exactly what you want out of a starting pitcher in OTP. As cost of acquisition is a lot lower than Burnes, so if you need an ace caliber starting pitcher, Woodruff is who you're going for most of the time. The cost of acquisition is not that low, but he's just such a good pitcher that he's almost always worth it. Again, if you need that high-end starting pitcher type guy. Now, Freddie Peralta as a slightly lower-end starting pitcher, but still absolutely one of the better starting pitchers out there. He's surprisingly cheap to acquire. He's more of a middle rotation cost acquisition, although he's certainly an upper middle to lower top rotation type pitcher in terms of his talent, and very affordable, which is another very nice draw from at least me in him. Very dominant stuff, very solid movement, not bad control. Next up is Tyler Black, who is a solid corner outfield prospect. He has good left field defense, solid right field defense. Can develop into an average hitter, which is not too uncommon. He's almost fully developed, and he's not that old as a prospect, but the cost of acquisition is next to nil, which is the biggest draw for him as well. Aaron Ashby. I'm not actually sure if he's considered a net negative or just not very good, but he's pretty much a left-handed Freddie Peralta, maybe a little bit worse around the margins, but cost controlled. He's cheap. He's on a very nice contract, running 7 years. He's a left-handed starting pitcher with really good stuff, solid movement, and not bad control. So a lot to like with Ashby here. We got Garrett Mitchell. who's on this list because of his cost of acquisition. Now he's almost 25. He's coming up on that. He's unlikely to fully develop, but he doesn't really need to develop much more to be a solid player. He's got some of the best base running in all of OTP. He has really good left field defense. And as a batter, sure, he's not going to fully develop to a well above average hitter, but the odds are that he ends up as an average hitter or so. And with that dominant defense and base running, that makes him a valuable player at really low cost of acquisition. Jerry Weimer, likewise, is very unlikely to his batting potential, which is really what he needs to be an above average hitter. So you're realistically looking at a below average to average hitter at best. Base running, once again, pretty solid, and solid right field defense. He's the type of player who's, again, really cheap to acquire, and that's the big draw. If you need a right fielder and you're making a trade with the Brewers, he can certainly step in and fill that position for you with potential for a little bit more. Now, Jefferson Caro is a young catching prospect, only 20 years old, with solid, not great, but solid defense and a solid bat that comes around, not quite up to, but around league average, with a little bit of potential for more, however, given his age and already pretty high end development. With Caro, the big thing here is that although his cost of acquisition is not particularly cheap, he is comparatively cheap to other catching prospects, especially other higher end catching prospects, and has the potential to exceed his ratings and become an even bigger player. Last up, we've got Cam Robinson, who is a solid relief pitcher who costs literally nothing to acquire. Very good movement, solid to strong stuff, and not the worst control. So again, if you need a middle reliever, especially one with a little more stamina, Robinson is not a bad player to do or to use to get such a or he is a solid player to fill such a need. Anyways, that's going to do it for the Brewers, so we'll go ahead and head on to, I believe it is the Twins up next. All right, with the Minnesota Twins, there are a couple of interesting players here. First off is Giovanni Moran, whose biggest appeal is a left-handed middle relief pitcher. You've seen this profile before. Really high stuff, very strong movement, slightly lower control, very minimal cost of acquisition, very quality middle reliever, higher stamina than most relievers, and of course, that's pretty much all there is to say about him. Cheap and cost controlled, very solid player. Michael A. Taylor has been a favorite of mine for a couple of years now. Center field, obviously a very difficult position. He plays it very well defensively. Not the greatest bat in the world, certainly below average, but not cripplingly bad either. He's a cheap player to acquire and to pay. And of course, if you need a center fielder, more of a stopgap than a long-term option. I mean, really, with center fielders, you have to compare him to Michael Ciani. It's really, really tough to beat Michael Ciani right now, but Michael A. Taylor is certainly a cheap option if you, for whatever reason, are not trading for Ciani. Now, I'm not going to try to pronounce his first name. I've failed before. So, Julian became legendary for his World Baseball Classic success. As a hitter, he's currently approximately league average. Now, the big fallback here is the defense. He's maybe somewhat viable in left field, but he's really restricted to first base. He costs next to nothing to get, though, and if he continues to develop, he can become a solid player. I would once again refer you to a Tristan Casas comparison for the potential batting profile. He is a very solid hitter overall, to be sure, with very low cost of acquisition. Now, Ronnie Henriquez is kind of difficult. Sometimes he's pricier, sometimes he's not. The big thing here is that the Twins sometimes do not really consider him viable as a starting pitcher for whatever reason, in which case he tends to be cheaper. Right now, in this particular instance, they seem to think of him as a starter, and he's a little more expensive. He comes with plus stuff, solid movement, solid control overall. A solid starting pitcher pretty much in his entirety. So Henriquez is certainly a very good player, and sometimes at a lower acquisition price. However, if he is expensive, he's sometimes not worth getting. Noah Miller, a shortstop prospect. Now, this defense is once again going to come in big time. He is a lower cost of acquisition player. He's 20, and he has a bat that is a little bit below league average, but not bad. So, again, it's pretty much just another one of these shortstop prospects, a switch hitter. Same thing as a lot of these other guys. And Alex Schreff, next to nothing at cost of acquisition, just an okay middle reliever. Just the kind of guy you pick up at a trade with the Twins just because you can and because he's there as a middle reliever should you need him. Anyways, we're going to head on to the Yankees next, and I believe the Yankees are going to be the last team that I'll cover in this video since we're at about a 45-minute mark. With the Yankees, I'm going to split this up into two bits, the prospects and the major league players, because there is once again a whole lot to cover here. First off is Yasan Dominguez, and the weirdest thing about Yasan Dominguez to me is that at least within OTP, as he gets worse, he gets better. He used to be pretty much impossible to trade for as a mediocre prospect. Now I actually think he's a better prospect than he was before somehow. He is cheaper to get. Now he's 20 years old and he's nearly fully developed, which is absolutely ridiculous to think about considering that his bat is actually really good. Dominguez has become, for me at least, one of the better corner outfield prospects in OTP. The defense, obviously very good, solid base running to boot. Now, the big thing here is that at 20 years old and heavy development already in place, there is certainly the potential for him to exceed his potential, especially with that eye, which is 100% developed. So something to watch out for. He's, of course, a switch hitter. So big time potential with Dominguez that he is a pretty strong chance of reaching. Now, he's not cheap to get, but as one of the best prospects in baseball, he is cheap relative to his talent level. Spencer Jones, not quite the same caliber, of course, as a corner outfield prospect, but a solid fielder with a decent bat, 22-ish years old, has the potential to grow into a solid player. And the big thing here, though, is the cost of acquisition, which is not very high. Luis Serna is this type of pitcher pops up a lot. It's very weird to me. Same kind as Chase Petty, where he's just the dominant potential, very well developed for his age, and yet he's not very expensive to get. It's very strange that this type of pitching prospect is just so common. But Cerna is almost a must-have, especially once you consider his 90 to 92 mile an hour velocity, which at less than 19 years old is not. There's a good chance that improves, which adds further to his already really strong stuff potential. A lot to like about Cerna. Austin Wells, kind of like Spencer Jones, but a little bit more developed. Can start as a corner outfield day one. Very weirdly, he is a catcher by his nature, though you're almost certainly not going to use him there, and he is a viable first baseman. I would honestly compare him to a worse Spencer Torkelson, really. He's going to be almost certainly used as a corner outfielder. His cost of acquisition seems to be as a catcher, so he comes cheaper. He's really, the appeal is that he is a cheaper player to get. Yoendris Gomez is a kind of weird player. He's probably going to be a reliever, although he is certainly a viable starter as well. Nearly fully developed, lowerish cost of acquisition. Those are really the big draws with him. Anthony Siegler, one of the rare catchers that is not very expensive to get. Solid defense, good personality. Not a bad bat, to be honest. Very close to major league average, especially considering his very high eye. He's a switch hitter. Cost of acquisition is next to nil, which is, of course, the big draw here. And last up for the Yankees, we've got Randy Vasquez, who is a starting pitcher. He's likely going to slot into your rotation on opening day. Solid movement, developing stuff, and okay control. Ultimately, at 24, he's unlikely to develop too much. So really what you're looking at here is pretty much just a bottom rotation starter you can acquire for cheap with a little bit of potential upside. So just another one of those types of pitchers. Ultimately, the big appeal with Vasquez is absolutely his cost of acquisition, which is very low. So again, if you just need somebody to slot into the rotation, he is certainly an option. Anyways, with that said, we are going to conclude this section of the undervalued players. The next video is going to start up with the Mets. I think at this point we're probably going to be on pace for potentially 4 or 5 of these in total, including the summary video, which will have all of the most general stuff. Anyways, thanks for watching, you guys. I hope this was helpful, and I will see you on the next one.